You are about to enjoy a production of the Ella Wellness Network. This is Wellness Fixes the Pod. I'm your host, Dr. Kelsey Vick, and I'm so happy you're here. Welcome to the Wellness Sisterhood. You guys, I have 6 baby showers, 6 weekends in a row, starting the second weekend in February. A lot of my friends are pregnant right now. A lot of them are asking me, hey, what can I do to prepare my body for birth and for the remainder of my pregnancy? So today's episode is going to be super fun. It's just, I wanted to create it like I'm chatting with a friend, right? Like I'm telling a friend who's pregnant what she should do for her body in order to help make birth a little bit easier on her from a pelvic floor PT's perspective. It's important for all of us to know. I know a lot of my listeners are not necessarily pregnant or not even close to being pregnant or in that stage at all, but I think it's so important for us as women to start to learn about these different stages in our lives. Pregnancy, our periods, right? Do you remember the first time you learned about your period? It was like, what is going to happen to my body? Same thing with menopause, right? Menopause is still this sort of like fog off in the distance for most of us of like, okay, what's going to happen to my body during menopause? And I feel like pregnancy and birth are a few of those life stages that it is just good to know about. So I'm super excited about this episode. It's like, I'm going to approach it just like me talking to one of my friends. Like, what do I think as a pelvic floor PT they should be doing from a physical standpoint and also like a mindfulness standpoint to prep their bodies to make birth a little bit easier on their bodies and just give themselves like the best chance for the most seamless birth experience, the most seamless postpartum experience. So I hope you guys are ready to dive in. Honestly, I know you're probably clicking through if you're not in this stage, but again, I think this is so important for all of us to learn, understand a little earlier on, and just have that knowledge, right? And again, save this episode if this is going to be you in the next coming months or years. That way you can come back, go through some of these tips and tricks, especially when you're going through pregnancy and you're like, okay, I've read the birthing books, I've done all of this, like what can I do for my body? This is the episode for you. Welcome back to Wellness Fixes the Pod. I'm your host, Dr. Kelsey Vick, a board-certified orthopedic doctor of physical therapy, a pelvic floor physical therapist, and the owner and founder of the Ella Wellness Sisterhood. And again, I'm so excited for today's episode. This is where my love for pelvic floor PT is going to come in, and we're just going to get talking about all of the body things we can do in order to help our bodies as women during pregnancy. So I want to start off with a little bit of a disclaimer because I feel like I'm not going to mean any of these things coming off in like a, you should do this, and if you don't do this, your body will hate you kind of way. I don't want it to come off like that. I have never been pregnant. I have no idea what it's like to be pregnant. And I know so many of my listeners and my friends who are pregnant are going to be like, Kelsey, you have no idea. And that is totally valid because I don't. However, I have treated a lot of pregnant and postpartum women. And so I'm coming from their standpoint, just their perspectives. I talk to them a lot. I ask them a lot of questions. And so that's where I'm coming from today. In addition to the extensive knowledge that I have within the pelvic floor and the rehab side of things for that. So I'm mixing both their experiences and just chatting with all of these moms and then also my knowledge. So I'm hoping to give you guys the best toolbox for pregnancy and to just basically prepare your body for birth. So before we get into the guide of what to do in your toolbox of the components that you should be incorporating into your daily mobility, daily movement routines, I want to start off with a little bit of basics just about the human body and pregnancy and breathwork too. So we'll start off at the top, and I know you guys are probably sick of me talking about breathwork if you have been a Wellness Fixes the Pod listener for a while, but breathwork is hugely important, and the mechanics that go into breathwork impact pregnancy and your pelvic floor a lot. So with breathing, in general, our diaphragm and our pelvic floors match each other. And so as our diaphragm descends, our pelvic floor descends. And as our diaphragm relaxes up, our pelvic floor relaxes up. So on an inhale, in order for us to get air into our lungs, our diaphragm descends, increasing that cavity within our rib cage in order for that air to go from a high pressure environment to a low pressure environment right within our lungs. As that diaphragm descends, that pelvic floor descends. As they descend, they both lengthen, right? So that's that super lengthening of that muscle tissue in the pelvic floor on the inhale. On the exhale, they both relax up. The diaphragm to push the air out of the lungs or help push the air out of the lungs, and then the pelvic floor to maintain that pressure gradient within the abdominal cavity. And so that's with normal breathing. With pregnancy, as the baby grows and grows, the ability for that diaphragm to actually descend on the inhale gets less and less because the baby is growing, right? You're going to have something that gets a little bit in the way of your inhale. So a lot of pregnant women start to have more of this shallow breathing pattern. They say it's harder to feel like they're getting a good solid breath. They say, I'm getting out of breath more and more and more. And usually it's because that diaphragm just doesn't have as far down to descend to bring as much air into the lungs. Now, in addition to that, that means the pelvic floor also doesn't have that same change, right? It's not lengthening as much. The pelvic floor is also supporting a lot of the organs in that growing baby within, like it's working against gravity, right? So it's having to work a little bit harder than it normally does without a baby. So those are both things that are completely normal with pregnancy. And so a lot of the tips and tricks that I will give some of my friends and that I'll give you guys in this podcast episode is working with our bodies in order to make up for some of the limitations that we might have when that baby is growing, right? So again, and it's not limitations in a bad way, it's limitations in a good way, but it is completely normal for us to become a little bit more of shallow breathers, a little bit more difficulty lengthening that pelvic floor and actually relaxing through those hips. And so a lot of the tips and tricks I'll give today are things to do to open up your hips, open up your pelvic floor, help your breathing mechanics, help your like little stabilizing muscles in order to sort of combat some of those expected functional limitations and breathing limitations that we might have during pregnancy. The other thing that's completely normal during pregnancy and a really good thing is that our ligaments start to become more and more relaxed. That's so that our pelvis can actually expand in order to deliver the baby. So it's a very evolutionary thing, right? Like we need our ligaments to become a little bit more lax so that we have a little bit more flexibility within our system in order for that baby to have enough room to come out of our pelvis. I don't know if you guys have seen the pelvis model, but if you look at where the baby's head's having to come through and you look at the general structure of a woman's pelvis, it doesn't add up, right? So our ligaments have to become a little bit more relaxed in order to allow that to happen. So ligament laxity is a huge thing that happens during and after pregnancy, especially if you're breastfeeding. The hormones involved with breastfeeding are also the hormones that contribute to that ligament laxity. And so during pregnancy and even postpartum, especially if you're breastfeeding, you might feel tightness within the muscles, not only because you're having to support a growing baby, but also because your ligaments, which are a prime stabilizer for our body, it's subconscious stabilization, right? We don't even have to think about stabilizing through our ligaments, but those start to become a little bit looser. So our muscles are cued to stabilize even more. And so they're overworking, our posture's changing in order to help us stabilize even more, especially as our belly grows. Like all of these things are happening, but it is completely normal to feel that like tension or an increase in tension within your muscles because those ligaments are getting a little bit more relaxed and our muscles are having to kick in a little bit more. So a lot of the tips and tricks that I'll give my friends and I'll give patients is working as much as we can those deep stabilizing muscles so that they are not overloaded as those ligaments become more and more relaxed. And again, our core expands. Like we don't have as much stabilization in general because our muscles are lengthening, especially in our abdominal region, but it's about working against some of the things that are happening within our body, combating some of the like ligament laxity that we're having with some of the deep stabilizing muscles in order to help you feel better during pregnancy and also prepare you for postpartum, when you're having to hold baby and you're like, oh my gosh, my body just feels loosey-goosey all over. We can do things during pregnancy in order to help the recovery after and help you feel stronger after you actually deliver the baby. So again, both of these things completely normal. I don't want it to scare you at all. It happens to all of us. And again, both are good things and both are accommodations that need to happen within our body in order to have a healthy delivery. But a lot of the tips and tricks that I would give my friends and that I'm going to give you guys today is surrounding how we can even out some of those expected limitations. So for your pregnancy guidebook, for how to prep your body to help during birth and delivery and just even postpartum period after, I'll go through a pelvic floor PT's like guidebook, right? Toolbox. And I might even think of more after this episode, after talking with some of my friends and being like, oh, I need to do a part 2. So stay tuned. But these are definitely priority items that I think you guys should be doing and that I will be doing whenever I am pregnant every day in order to help prepare my body and help my body feel better during pregnancy, but also prepare it for delivering a baby and postpartum. So the first one, if you get nothing else from this episode, proper breath work is the number one thing to focus on during pregnancy in order to help those stabilizing muscles, help that pelvic floor lengthen, help those postural muscles. Like it really attacks all of the limitations that we might experience because of pregnancy with the ligament laxity, with the decreased breathing patterns, like all of those things. Proper breath work can help us combat most of those things within one motion. So with proper breathing, your rib cage is expanding. It's improving its mobility from the inside out. Your pelvic floor is lengthening, which again, it usually has trouble doing during pregnancy because it's trying to work so hard against all of the different forces acting on it. Proper breath work also helps our pelvic floor to know when to contract and when to relax. So it allows for both parts, both components, contraction and relaxation to happen to help stabilize that area of the pelvis, to stabilize against gravity. A lot of the time, pregnant women experience like leaking with jumping, coughing, sneezing. There's just so much pressure built up within the system, and proper breath work can really help to combat some of those things because it allows the pelvic floor to relax when it needs to relax rather than staying so contracted all the time, and then contract when it needs to contract in order to help support. So it's cueing both and allowing the pelvic floor to do both of its functions when it comes to supporting our like the growing baby and then also our organs. The pelvic floor has a lot of other functions, but speaking specifically with pregnancy, that's what proper breathing can do to help our pelvic floor. So I'll guide you guys through a breathwork like form cues that you can try and do if you're an auditory learner. I'm definitely more visual, so I will have to incorporate a visual on either my Instagram or maybe even a YouTube video that y'all can go look back at to see. But I want you guys on that inhale to think about your rib cage expanding 360 degrees, which in turn will allow that belly, the side body, and that back body to expand. So 360-degree inhale. I don't want it to go up into your neck and chest. I want it to really stay within that rib cage and within that belly, but not just belly breathing. I want that side belly and that back body to also expand on that inhale. On the exhale, I want you to think about exhaling from the bottom up. So really gather your lower abdominal region, exhale, zip up to the rib cage, and then wrap that rib cage around like a hug at the very, very end. I want that full exhale in order to really cue the expiration of all of that air, but then also that elevation of the pelvic floor, the elevation of the diaphragm as well. So inhale 360 degrees like an umbrella, especially in the side bodies, especially in the back body. Exhale, zipping up from the pubic bone, exhaling from the bottom up, and then wrapping around that rib cage at the very end like a hug. So this exhale from the bottom up allows more pressure to be captured and sort of brought out in that exhalation rather than bearing down into our pelvic floor when there's already so much pressure going down into our pelvic floor. Think about bearing down like you're really trying to have a bowel movement on the toilet. Like we don't want to force anything, right? We really want to use our breath in order to allow the relaxation to naturally happen within our pelvic floor, within our abdominal region, and then also exhaling from the bottom up so that we're not bearing down and we're not putting more and more pressure into that pelvic floor. So speaking of bowel movements, as a honestly, human in general, we should all be having a squatty potty. I have one in my primary bathroom. I've given it to a lot of my patients for, especially pregnant women who Constipation's a real big deal, right? It's a real issue because again, we're not necessarily contracting and relaxing that pelvic floor, which in turn helps to like relax some of those sphincters, some of those control mechanisms for our pee and poop, right? So a squatty potty really helps us position our hips, position our pelvis in a good position to allow for better relaxation, better breathing into that pelvic floor to allow for a bowel movement to occur. Trust me, if you're pregnant, you will know you want all of the help when it comes to constipation, when it comes to having a bowel movement, when it comes to just general bloating. Like a squatty potty is going to be amazing both during pregnancy, way before you're thinking about getting pregnant, and then also postpartum. Like get your whole family on it because it is amazing. And from a pelvic PT standpoint, a lot of the things that we do during pregnancy and postpartum is related to optimizing the position of the things that we can control in order to indirectly or directly affect other regions in our body, like our pelvic floor, right? So I mentioned our pelvic floor cannot quite descend and raise up as well when we are pregnant because that diaphragm, again, doesn't descend as well. So that pressure change doesn't happen. It's just a lot harder for our inhales to get sent to that pelvic floor to allow that lengthening. And so a way that we can get lengthening within our pelvic floor and relaxation within our pelvic floor to help us during pregnancy and prepare for birth, because we want relaxation of that pelvic floor to allow baby to pass through, right? That's where we don't want any sort of like gripping on or tightening because we really want an easier passageway for baby to be born, right? So a lot of what I do as a pelvic floor PT is teach people different strategies in order to open up different areas of their abdominal region, of their rib cage, of their pelvic floor, of their hips, in order to affect each of those areas to help their symptoms, to help birth, to help delivery, to help postpartum, to help whatever phase that they're in. So since the pelvic floor cannot relax or contract as efficiently, we really need to focus on what we can control in order to help lengthen that pelvic floor as much as we can and target that pelvic floor as much as we can. And so we do that by changing the motion of our hips, in addition to the breath work that I just mentioned. But we do that in hip positioning, right? And so think about your pelvis as a bowl, right? Like just a bowl that's upright, like a soup bowl. The bottom of that bowl has a little bit of a hammock that is like the pelvic floor, right? And we're going to go very, very basic, but you have the front pelvic floor, the middle pelvic floor, the back pelvic floor. Like you have different sections of the pelvic floor, and different positions of the hip controls what part of the pelvic floor lengthens. So rotating your hips in, your knees in, so think like pigeon-toed, but it's really coming from the hip. So I really want you guys to think, okay, I'm in standing, I'm putting my knees in, or I like to really do a child's pose with your knees in and your feet out. So if you can picture a child's pose, if you're familiar with yoga poses, that's one of my favorite positions actually for this, but that really helps to lengthen the back of the pelvic floor. So the knees in, hip internal rotation really helps to open up the back. In contrast, hip external rotation, so think like happy baby or a child's pose with the knees out, or that butterfly stretch like at the very end of a yoga practice where your feet are together and then your knees are out in like almost a crisscross applesauce, but not really. I think it's a butterfly. I'm not familiar with the yoga terms, but think about that position. That really helps to open up the front of your pelvic floor. So we can shift positions of our hips in order to help open up our pelvic floor. In general, a lot of the time during birth, we want the opening of the middle and the back part of that pelvic floor. And so if you can think about the typical position that you see women birth in, it is like that happy baby position, right? So knees up into that external rotation, feet up, which is really opening the front of that pelvic floor, right? And so one of the things that I'll mention later is just researching different birthing positions that might be possible for you, that are comfortable for you, because from an anatomical standpoint, rotating the knees in, internally rotating the hips, opens the back of that pelvic floor. So sometimes different birthing positions that might be more comfortable are on your like hands and knees, quadruped position with those knees in, feet out to allow for better opening at the back of that pelvic floor, or even a sideline where your knees are like that top knee is in and that foot is up to sort of open the back of that pelvic floor. Again, I might need to do a video of all these because I know that that's going to be a little bit easier to picture when I'm like showing you, but think about these things when it comes to like actual the delivery of the baby, right? And so opening up the hips, opening up the pelvic floor, another hugely important thing to do during pregnancy in order to help lengthen through the pelvic floor, allow that good like opening, yeah, just mobility of the pelvic floor in order to help during pregnancy, but also prepare for birth. And then the last thing for the hip and pelvic floor is soft tissues. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with, I hate this term, but it's called mom butt, right? Where as the baby grows, you shift your hips forward, you clench your glutes in order to help stabilize. And so what we're really having is this really like jammed forward position of the hips without opening up the back of those glutes. So a lot of the time I will recommend soft tissue to my patients to the back of the hips in order to contrast that contraction that naturally happens in order to support a growing baby and a growing belly, right? So a lot of the time I'll take like a lacrosse ball or a foam roll. And again, I highly recommend you ask your physician, your pelvic floor PT, because if you have sciatica, if you have tailbone pain, whatever, this might change a little bit. But I usually recommend some sort of soft tissue work in order to open up the back of the hips so that we can get that full internal rotation motion and lengthen through that pelvic floor, but also just help your hips and glutes feel that much better and make them that much more easily accessible when it comes to strengthening them both in pregnancy and postpartum. Okay, and another region we want to look at is the rib cage. So thoracic mobility. As that baby grows, we start to sort of expand our rib cage and it starts to get a little stiff because we can't rotate as well, we can't bend forward as well, we can't bend back as well, like it just starts to get stiff. So I always recommend thoracic mobility work, rib cage mobility work for my patients, where we're really just focusing on rotating through the mid back and the upper back and not the low back. I mean, although that's good too, but we want to lock out the low back in order to really target that rib cage area and help with that ribcage mobility to help not only during pregnancy and that stiffness that you get in your mid back during pregnancy, but also when you're wearing baby postpartum, when you are working on your diastasis recti or diastasis recti symptoms after, like that ab separation after, because again, as our ribcage widens, that's going to naturally affect the line in between our abdominals. And so working on that ribcage mobility can help postpartum with the amount of symptoms you have within your pelvic floor or also within your like abdominal region. In addition to that thoracic mobility, again, as the ligaments start to get more and more relaxed, a lot of my patients get more and more tight, usually because their muscles are starting to have to work in overtime. So I always recommend postural strengthening and those deep stabilizing muscle work in order to help combat some of that ligament laxity that happens. So that includes a lot of like opening up through the chest, working on the back side of our backs, like our postural muscles that help us to stand upright, that postpartum will help us to carry baby and breastfeed and hold baby without feeling all the aches and all the pains. So thoracic mobility work, in addition to some of those deep postural stabilization work, is hugely, hugely important, especially during pregnancy. And then lastly, before I go into sort of like a look into it section, but lastly, mindfulness meditation. So especially during the actual delivery and the birthing process, it's hugely important that we're able to tap into that parasympathetic nervous system, the one where we're able to sort of relax, breathe deeply, inhale, exhale. And again, this is the one where all of you mamas who have already delivered babies who are like, Kelsey, you don't know what you're talking about. You are totally right. I don't. But I do know that if we can keep access and try and keep access to that parasympathetic nervous system as long as we can, our pelvic floor is going to lengthen, our body's going to relax into it, and we're just going to be a little bit more comfortable during the birthing experience. So set a playlist that calms you, work on some of that breath work, which naturally helps us to access all of that like parasympathetic nervous system, rest, digest, calming part of the nervous system. It also, mindfulness stuff helps with the constipation too, because again, parasympathetic nervous system, rest, digest, meaning like bowel movements as well. So all of those things are working in your favor, both pregnancy and during birth, and then also postpartum too. Okay, and then the last tips that I would give some friends to look into, again, this may or may not be like beneficial to you, but I think it's something to look into. I mentioned this one already, but the different birthing positions, whether that be quadruped, side lying, basically internal rotation of the hips. Now, I know some of my patients have said, they just didn't have a choice, right? C-section, like it is going to be sometimes not in your control, which is why I think it's good to research, especially if you don't have someone who has already told you about any of this. So just different birthing positions. A ball can help, like one of those little peanut balls can help, especially if you like sideline. So different things like that, just look into to see, oh, wait, I didn't even know about this, right? Just to kind of dip your toes in the water when it comes to different positions to birth in. You can also look into how your partner can physically help you. So again, I mentioned that ligament laxity that happens all over the body, but within the pelvis especially. And a lot of the time, if a partner can help press on either side of your pelvis, so that like large flat part on either side of your hips, and really press in, that can feel really, really good to someone who's pregnant. And so just looking into helpful tips and tricks that your partner might be able to do that are comfortable for you in order to help both during pregnancy, but then also during delivery. Ab separation will also occur, and that's okay. Like a lot of people are so scared of diastasis recti and all of the pelvic floor things that come after it, but that's why pelvic floor PTs are here. It is totally normal, it's natural, it's going to happen, but I just want you guys to know there are people to help. If you are experiencing leaking or difficulty, pain, like pain with tampon insertion or penetration, like all of these things, postpartum and even during pregnancy, right? There are people to help. So just know that, because a lot of my friends who even know what I do, it's like they didn't know that I did that, right? And so it's not very talked about, which is why I want to educate you guys so that even if you're in college right now listening to this, you know that when the time comes, there are people to help with that. And then a little side note, but pelvic floor PT postpartum is a must, especially if you want to return to all of the things that you want to do, right? Especially if you're an athlete, especially if you're a runner, jumper, CrossFit, whatever. Like pelvic floor PT will just really set you up for success, set your body up for success after. And there's so many things that they can help with that you might be struggling with, that you might not even be aware that you're struggling with postpartum, because you're worried about this new little human in your life and nourishing him or her. You're worried about that person without actually paying attention to you. And so pelvic floor PT is a time where you can focus on your body, what can help you, and then all the other time can be given to the new little human, right? And again, that's not, I totally am biased, but I know so many of my friends who just didn't even know that was an option. And so I think it's very, very beneficial. I've had moms as patients who have done pelvic floor PT after their second and not after their first. And they're like, oh my gosh, what a world of difference. Like I have people who have compared and contrasted, and it's just, they say it's one of the best things they did for themselves. So highly recommend. Put that away in the brain as something to definitely do postpartum. So I think that is all of my chatting to all of my pregnant friends, but also to all of you guys who are, 99% of my audience is female, except for maybe like my dad, my husband, like these people who are just here to support me. So a lot of us are women, and I hope that if you are pregnant, if you plan to become pregnant one day, if you'd like to become a mom, that you save this episode, come back to it. I'll try and do some follow-up videos on just like the visuals, because again, I'm a very visual learner. So check back on my YouTube or my Instagram to see some of those. I might do them on YouTube because I think it'll be more of a long form content, but yeah, check back because I want to put that out there for you. That way you can actually watch and visualize. So I hope you guys enjoyed this little friend chat about pregnancy, about birth, and about pelvic floor PT, and all of the things that my mind goes to when working with someone who is pregnant or who is postpartum or preparing for delivery. But thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you wouldn't mind, please like, comment, subscribe, review. We have a lot of fun things, fun guests coming down the pipeline. I am like so excited. I hope you guys are too. It's gonna be so fun. I promise it won't be all about pregnancy, postpartum, but I do feel like it's again, like I said earlier, like I want to learn more about menopause too, because it's something that's sort of the Wild West for me. Like it's so foggy, so hazy off in the distance. And my hope is that a lot of my younger audience also wants to learn about pregnancy, learn about their bodies, so that when that time comes, they are steps, you guys are like steps ahead of everyone else, because you're like, wait, she told me this would come, 5 or 6 years ago, and now I know what to do. So my hope is to just empower you guys with that and with that knowledge, because now no one can take that away from you. And I think that is one of the best things of all. So thank you guys for joining me this episode, and I'll see you guys again on the next Wellness Big Sis the Pod episode.